Just 100 years ago, the idea of human beings taking to the air in machines was still only a dream. Until the Wright brothers sailed above Kitty Hawk. From that moment on, one visionary after another helped make it possible to fly farther, faster, safer. From Juan Trippe and the creation of Pan American Airways, to Anne Morrow Lindbergh and the popularization of flying. From Donald Douglas and the building of the DC-3, to Frank Whittle and the invention of the jet engine. This is the story of the men, women, and machines that conquered the sky.
Chasing the Sun was made possible by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation to enhance public understanding of the role of technology. The foundation also seeks to portray the lives of the men and women engaged in scientific and technological pursuit. The Arthur Vining Davis Foundations, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
On the morning of December 17, 1903, two bicycle mechanics named Orville and Wilbur Wright stood on the beach at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. They flipped a coin to see who would be the first person in human history to fly. Orville won. He climbed aboard their flying machine and sailed into the air for 12 seconds, traveling 120 feet. When word of the Wright brothers' accomplishments spread, it brought cries of amazement from some and fired the imagination of many others. And yet, in 1903, America was a place where most people still did not have electricity and had never seen a car, much less a plane. In such a world, it was impossible to fathom what this new technology might lead to. Perhaps it would be just a novelty, like the kite or the hot air balloon. Or maybe, just maybe, it would change everything. To the Wright brothers, their invention was, above all, a way to prosper. To protect their machine from prying eyes, they quietly retreated to their bicycle shop in Ohio, and at Wilbur's urging, put their plane back under wraps.
While I am taking up the investigation for pleasure rather than profit, I think there is a possibility of achieving fame and fortune from it.
With many others also trying to invent aircraft, Wilbur became obsessed with securing a patent for their plane before the competition stole their ideas. Over the next 5 years, the brothers rarely flew, instead spending their time working on improving their technology.
Wilbur Wright was a very stubborn, a very lonely, a very determined man, a very methodical man who was willing to work for years in obscurity in order to develop a system that made possible flight in a way that no one else had achieved it up to that time.
The Wright brothers' competitors often built a plane one day and tried to fly it the next. But the brothers tested each new approach in their workshop and built the world's first wind tunnel to help them do it. Their breakthrough discovery was a system of control called wing warping. It involved twisting the wings by pulling on them with wires so that the plane would turn in the desired direction. Wing warping kept the brothers in the sky, even as their competitors came crashing to the ground.
I do not take dangerous chances, both because I have no wish to get hurt and because a fall would stop my experimenting, which I would not like at all. The man who wishes to keep at the problem long enough to really learn anything positively must not take dangerous risks.
Finally, in 1908, 5 years after their first flight, the Wright brothers' patent was approved. Now they were ready to show the world that they had mastered flight. The place they chose for their international debut was Paris, where French aviators had recently made their own short flights. As a result, the French were claiming that it was in France, not in America, where man first flew.
The French, of course, knew about the reports that Wilbur Wright had flown, but they remained skeptical as to what this actually meant. They wanted to see him fly, and as long as he refused to show them that he could fly, they insisted that he was a bluffer, that he was a fraud.
On August 8, 1908, in front of a skeptical crowd of dignitaries and journalists, a confident Wilbur Wright climbed aboard his machine and declared, "Gentlemen, I'm going to fly." On Wright's signal, his assistants released a rope holding a large weight. To the amazement of the crowd, Wright's flyer was catapulted into the air. The spectators were spellbound.
When they saw Wilbur Wright making tight circles over that field and just putting this airplane through its paces, obviously under complete control, he just blew them away. One of the great French aviators of the period who saw him fly just threw up his hands and said, you know, "Nous sommes battus. We're beaten."
In the weeks after, Wilbur flew the plane for excited crowds and the press. Francois Perret, a well-known aviation journalist, gave Wright an ecstatic review.
The day we had longed for had finally come. In the mechanical body of the great bird dwells a man, the man who had the admirable idea for it. The man whose powerful brain created its architecture, which is so ingenious and at the same time so simple. And as my mind roamed through the future, I had a vision of things to come.
But for the Wright brothers, the future would bring the harsh reality that their invention was also a dangerous one. Orville was demonstrating the Wright Flyer for the U.S. Army when a propeller split, causing him to lose control of the plane. The crash sent Orville and his passenger to the hospital. A distraught Orville wrote his brother a detailed account of the tragic flight.
Quick as a flash, the machine turned down in front and started straight for the ground. I discovered that it would not respond to the steering, which produced a most peculiar feeling of helplessness. Suddenly, just before reaching the ground, the machine began to right itself rapidly. A few feet more and we would have landed safely.
Orville's passenger, Lieutenant Thomas Selfridge, was violently thrown from the plane. He died hours later, becoming the first passenger ever killed in a powered airplane crash. For Orville, the notion that their invention had taken an innocent life would forever haunt him. Despite the tragedy at home, Wilbur's demonstrations in France were a source of enormous inspiration.
None of the French at that point were able to turn an airplane in the way that Wilbur Wright was. But far from discouraging them, this instead had the effect of pushing them into further experimentation. There was a tremendous outburst of activity in aeronautics in France, and by the summer of 1909, the French had certainly caught up with Wright and were about to overtake him.
One of the most enthusiastic of the French inventors was Louis Blériot. Unlike the Wright brothers, Blériot tested his theories in the air and often came crashing to the ground.
He was an engineer improving a new plane and with no pilot to drive it. So he had to drive it by himself, It was terrible, He didn't like that at all.
But Blériot was so determined to build a better plane that he continued to spend most of his savings and his wife's inheritance pursuing his dream. Then, in 1909, a European newspaper offered a large sum of money to the first pilot to cross the English Channel. Blériot saw a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity.
Blériot and every pilot had need money to pay experience. And also, of course, winning the prize would be more than win money. It would be winning an international reputation and entering the legend of the new century.
While Blériot hurried to build a new plane, several of his rivals attempted to cross the channel. But powerful winds sent them all crashing into the murky waters. On July 25th, 1909, Blériot's plane was ready. But a fierce storm was rushing through the channel. And the bad weather combined with memories of past crashes to give Blériot second thoughts.
I swear I wasn't in any mood to fly. I would have been happy if I'd been told the wind was blowing so hard there was no point in even trying. I was gripped by an uneasy feeling. What was going to happen? Would I make it to Dover?
Then word came that the storm had cleared. As Blériot worked with his beautiful single-winged aircraft, built in the shape of a dragonfly, his confidence returned.
Now I had courage for two. I thought only of my machine. The engine, the propeller, and everything was ready. I assumed that the flight would lead to victorious success, unless there was an accident. My plane rapidly accelerated and thrust itself above the ocean. Suddenly, the wind and its blasts became stronger in a disturbing fashion. For 10 minutes, I kept on alone in the middle of the vast sea. I finally saw the right side of the English coast. I pointed my plane toward it. At the risk of smashing everything, I cut the ignition at 20 feet. Now, it was up to chance.
Once again, Blériot's flight ended in a crash.
The landing gear took it rather badly. The propeller was damaged. But my word, so what? I had made it across the channel.
For Blériot, the money he had won was of secondary importance. What mattered above all was that his aerial exploits had made him a legend. By 1912, it had become clear to many what the airplane's ultimate purpose would be: entertainment. Across the country, young men began putting on aerial demonstrations for paying customers who were eager to see for themselves that human beings could fly. Surprisingly, the ultimate entertainer was not a man, but a woman, an actress named Harriet Quimby. While attending an air show in upstate New York, Quimby became mesmerized by the possibilities of the airplane. She then convinced a pilot to give her flying lessons. It was an unthinkable step for most women of the time, but not for Harriet Quimby.
She was a big advocate of owning your own automobile, being in charge of your own destiny, to be as independent as possible, male or female.
Quimby knew that there was money to be made on the airshow circuit and set out to prove that she could pilot a plane as well as any man.
The men flyers have given out the impression that aeroplaning is very perilous work, something that an ordinary mortal should not dream of attempting. But when I saw how easily the men flyers manipulated their machines, I said, I could fly.
And she certainly could. Soon, Harriet Quimby, with her trademark purple flying suit, was one of the most popular aviators on the airshow circuit. Good Housekeeping magazine dubbed her the American Bird Woman. In an effort to increase her popularity, Quimby came up with an audacious plan. She would attempt to become the first woman to cross the English Channel.
She knew that as an attraction, the more records that she set, the more valuable she would be as a commodity to sell tickets, and for a manager of an air meet to pay her more and more money. And that was her goal.
Ignoring her advisor's worry that it was impossible for a woman to complete such a feat, Quimby went to France and bought herself a Blériot flyer in which to make the flight.
The French coast was wholly invisible by reason of moving masses of mist. I could not see ahead of me or at all below. I knew that land must be in sight if I could only get below the fog and see it. So I dropped from an altitude of about 2,000 feet until the sunlight struck upon my face and my eyes lit upon the white and sandy shores of France.
Quimby landed on the beach of a tiny fishing village, where she was greeted with a hero's welcome. But only 3 months later, she was thrown from her plane and killed. A reporter for the Boston Globe wrote of this aerial pioneer, "She took her chances like a man and died like one." As long as entertainers were the only sizable market for planes, the Wright brothers had to put their dreams of getting rich on hold. But in 1914, as war loomed in Europe, Wilbur Wright realized that his invention was finally going to pay off.
No government will want to delay in the perfection of a flying machine. In order to be ready 1 year before the others, they will find the modest sum that we are asking for our invention.
In August of 1914, the great industrial powers of Europe went to war with one another. In the beginning, the plane was used only to observe opposing armies.
For the first time, somebody could get above the battlefield and look at what was going on. That was where it started. And of course, as soon as they realized the advantage of being able to see what was going on, right away you wanted to get rid of the other guy who's looking at what you're doing. And so that was the beginning of air combat, if you will.
Soon machine guns were mounted on fighter planes. Then bombers were developed, first with airmen manually dropping bombs over the side. The image of the plane as a powerful weapon of destruction was born. So too was the mystique of the fighter pilot.
One of the most surprising things is the emergence of the cult of the heroic aviator. Very few individual heroes emerge from the muck and the mire of the trenches. But everybody knows who the fighter pilots are. They become great national heroes.
One such pilot was 19-year-old British ace Albert Ball. In a letter home, it was clear that Ball was thrilled by the adventure of early air combat.
Cheerio, dears. Really, I'm having too much fun for a boy. I only got hit 11 times in the plane's wings. My windscreen was hit in 4 places. Also, the engine ran out of petrol. But I had a good sport and good luck. Ooh la la, topping, isn't it?
Sadly, Albert Ball's luck ran out. He was killed in air combat just before his 21st birthday. When World War I ended, many fighter pilots found work on a new, wilder airshow circuit. They entertained crowds by displaying maneuvers they had once used in dogfights. These barnstormers, as they came to be known, put on quite a show. Each stunt became more fantastic and more dangerous. But barnstormers offered more than just entertainment. They gave average Americans the chance to do something they had never done before: ride in a plane. Basil Lee Rowe was a former World War I ace who financed his passion for flying by giving rides to first-time passengers. He had a unique approach to testing a town for profitability.
I would buzz it a couple of times. If the people continued about their business, I did the same. But if the kids tried to follow me, I looked for a farmer's field from which to operate. When I found one, I buzzed the town to get the whole population following me like the children of Hamlet following the Pied Piper.
Every time he took somebody aloft, Basil wondered how they would react to their first time flying. One woman thoroughly surprised him.
Once I took up a woman who appeared to be a calm passenger. Suddenly, she shrieked, climbed out of the cockpit, and onto the lower wing like a practiced aerial acrobat. "What's wrong?" I yelled. Mouse, she yelled back.
It took Basil considerable effort to convince his passenger that a mouse in the cockpit was not nearly as dangerous as wing walking. Basil Rowe may have been willing to put up with anything that would keep him flying. But at $5 a ride, he was never going to get rich. Soon, however, someone would figure out a more profitable use for planes. On May 25, 1918, the U.S. Postal Service for the first time offered airmail. President Woodrow Wilson was on hand to witness the inaugural airmail flight. Captain Benjamin Lipsner was the man in charge.
The Washington postmaster held one of the mail bags open for the president. Mr. Wilson dropped in a letter addressed to Postmaster Patton of New York City. The president had canceled the stamp on the letter by autographing it. The engine coughed, the prop made one turn and backlashed into upright position. They tried it again and again. They failed. Sergeant, I said, check the gas tank. He mumbled and turned away so that I was sure the tank hadn't been filled. Get more gas from the hangar, I told the men. Well, this time the engine roared to life and the crowd cheered a little. Mr. Wilson smiled with relief at the sound of the engine, but he couldn't have felt a fraction of the relief I felt.
When the plane finally took off, the pilot, fresh out of flight school, flew in the wrong direction and landed further from his destination than when he took off. Ironically, the first U.S. airmail ended up being delivered by train. More than a few early mail pilots had a difficult time finding their way.
They used to talk about following the iron compass, following the railroad lines from place to place. Your map and what you saw, matching up your map to what you saw on the ground, was really the key to navigation in the early 1920s.
In bad weather, when landmarks were invisible, the job went from difficult to extremely dangerous. But that didn't stop a young daredevil named Dean Smith from answering an ad for an airmail pilot that read, "No experience necessary."
For the first winter or two I was on the mail, we had no heat in our planes. The windshields were poor, the cockpits had unsealed holes, and we suffered real physical distress. I used to have sections of newspapers stuffed inside my suit for more adequate insulation. Often, after I'd been out an hour or two, I would already be so cold that tears would run down my cheeks. Under such painful conditions, a pilot was obviously not capable of exercising his normal judgment.
Smith was inspired by his experiences to write the book By the Seat of My Pants, which told of his turbulent life as a mail pilot. He sometimes questioned his own sanity, given that the life expectancy for men in his profession was just 4 years.
Many people think the airmail is the next thing to suicide. I certainly had no wish to get killed, but I was not afraid of it. I would have been frightened if I thought I would get maimed or crippled for life, but there was little chance of that. A mail pilot was usually killed outright.
But even with all the danger and misery, Dean Smith loved his job.
What I could never tell was the beauty and exultation of flying itself. Above the haze layer, with the sun behind you or sinking ahead, alone in an open cockpit. There is nothing and everything to see. Threading one's way through the great piles of summer cumulus that hang over the plains, the cloud shapes are sculptured just for you. The life over the mountain ridges, the steady, pure air at dawn takeoffs. It was so alive and rich a life that any other conceivable choice seemed dull, prosaic, and humdrum.
With the help of pilots like Dean Smith, airmail service became a resounding success. And with increasing demand, Congress passed a law that allowed the government to hire private carriers to help deliver the mail. It was a decision with far-reaching consequences.
This was an important decision because out of this came the airlines that were going to dominate commercial aviation in the United States. Airlines like United Airlines, like American Airlines, like TWA. Those airlines all had their birth, in a sense, in this moment and were a result of that decision.
Private carriers were paid based on the weight of the mail they delivered. Some carriers took advantage of the government by mailing bricks and even cast iron stoves to increase their profits. It was a dubious beginning for the private airline industry. But the future was destined to be brighter, helped along by the most famous airmail pilot of all. In February of 1927, a young man named Charles Lindbergh arrived in San Diego, California. The custom-built plane, which he had struggled to raise the money to pay for and help design, was finally finished. In honor of the hometown of his most generous supporters, Lindbergh named it the Spirit of St. Louis. He was counting on this plane to help him win a $25,000 cash prize for the first aviator to fly from New York to Paris. 4 men had already died trying, but that didn't stop Lindbergh. He had tremendous confidence in himself and in his new plane.
What a beautiful machine it is, trim and slender, gleaming in its silver coat. All our ideas, all our calculations, all our hopes lie there before me, waiting to undergo the acid test of flight. For me, it seems to contain the whole future of aviation. When such planes can be built, there is no limitation to the air.
When Lindbergh arrived in Long Island, New York to prepare for his attempt, he attracted the attention of numerous reporters, most of whom were convinced that they would soon be writing the young man's obituary.
One of the things that made it so exciting was the fact that there had been a whole string of disasters related to attempts to fly the Atlantic. And they were disasters that had happened to multi-person teams, usually flying multi-engine airplanes. And now here comes this tousle-haired kid who wants to do this thing by himself in a single-engine airplane. And I mean, he's got a mom, and this is the kind of story that reporters fall in love with. He arrives in New York, and instantly he's Lucky Lindy. He's the flying fool. He's the kid. He's slim. He's a press agent's dream.
Unfortunately for Lindbergh, when the weather was right for takeoff, he had already been awake for 23 hours. Now he was embarking on a solo flight, which he knew could take as long as 2 days. Soon the Atlantic Ocean stretched out before him, vast and unknown. His biggest challenge was fighting the desire to sleep.
My eyes feel dry and hard as stones. The lids pull down with pounds of weight against the muscles. My whole body argues that nothing life can attain is quite so desirable as sleep.
Lindbergh began to hallucinate.
These phantoms speak with human voices, friendly, vapor-like shapes without substance, able to vanish or appear at will. At times, voices come out of the air itself, familiar voices, conversing and advising on my flight, discussing problems of my navigation, reassuring me, giving me messages of importance unattainable in ordinary life.
To wake himself, he slapped his face, but felt nothing. He held ammonia smelling salt to his nose and smelled nothing. Only his fear of death kept him awake.
And after some 27 or 28 hours, he looks out the window. He sees a fishing boat, and the fisherman comes out, and Lindbergh leans out the window and yells, "Which way is Ireland?" Well, Ireland was that way, and it was just a few miles more. And indeed, Lindbergh discovered he had made it.
Massive crowds welcomed Lindbergh as he landed at an airport outside of Paris. The French were enthralled by this milestone achievement. What would have taken nearly a week by boat, a fearless Lindbergh had done in a mere 33.5 hours. A French reporter said, "Lindbergh is more generous than Columbus. He has delivered us the continent of the sky."
From the moment Charles Lindbergh landed in Paris, the world had shrunk. Suddenly, in one swoop, one young man alone raised the money, helped design, helped navigate, and flew a plane from New York to Paris and linked these two continents. And that meant any two continents could now be linked. That meant that if one person could do this, imagine what a whole crew of people could do. Imagine what a team could do. Imagine what an airline could do.
Back home, Lindbergh was greeted with a ticker tape parade, the likes of which New York City had never seen before. The excitement swirling around Lindbergh continued to build. Politicians and businessmen eager to promote air travel commissioned Lindbergh to fly the Spirit of St. Louis throughout the United States. He went from city to city, selling the wonders of flying to average Americans. The journey provided Lindbergh the opportunity to explore his homeland.
That tour let me know my country as no man had ever known it before. I saw waves foaming on the rocks of Maine. Cloud layers pressing against Washington's Olympics. I saw California's Golden Gate. I dived into Death Valley, its hot sands 10 feet below my wheels. I landed in every state of the Union, spoke in scores of cities, dropped messages on still more. I tried to convince everyone who would listen that aviation had a brilliant future in which America should lead.
When Lindbergh completed his U.S. tour, he took on the world, extolling the virtues of aviation throughout Central and South America. His fondest hope was that being able to travel farther and faster would enable the peoples of different lands to come to understand each other better.
The thing that interests me is breaking up the prejudices between nations, linking them up through aviation.
But if Lindbergh's dream was going to come true, flying would have to move beyond its image as a pursuit for heroes and daredevils. It would have to become a way for regular people to get from here to there. In 1928, on a goodwill tour of Mexico, Charles Lindbergh paid a visit to the home of the American ambassador. There he met the ambassador's shy, reserved daughter, Anne. Lindbergh, who was himself famous for being shy, couldn't get the young woman out of his mind. Anne Morrow was also taken with him, as she confessed only to her diary.
The idea of this clear, direct, straight boy, how it has swept out of sight all other men I have known, all the pseudo-intellectuals, the sophisticates, the posers. All my life, in fact my world, is smashed.
I think Anne realized that she had been raised as something of an orchid, that she was a hothouse flower. And for the first time when Charles Lindbergh walked in, somebody had opened the door of the greenhouse, and this blast of bracing air came in. And I think it slapped her in the face and really awakened her in all sorts of ways.
On their first date, Charles took Anne flying.
I can't describe the flying. It was too glorious.
After a whirlwind courtship, they were married. Anne didn't take on the role of a typical housewife of the time. She became Lindbergh's navigator and radio operator. Together, they tackled Lindbergh's new job, mapping out potential overseas routes for the airlines. As they traveled, Anne Morrow Lindbergh began sharing with the American public what it felt like to fly.
Here we go. The roar of the engine, sputter, choke, but it smooths out now like a long sigh. Like a person breathing easily, freely. We turn from the lights of the city. We pivot on a wing. We roar over the earth. We did it. We are up. We are off.
While she often wrote about the exhilaration of flight, Anne also revealed her deepest fears.
Trying to go through very thick fog over the mountains, not seeing ahead, it is terribly confusing and brings a cold terror to you. You see, the fog is so deceiving. It lets you get a little glimpse of a hill, and then, while you're looking in the opposite direction, it covers it up, and you are utterly confused. Fog is very terrible. It really does seem like death.
Despite the danger, Anne soon logged more miles as a passenger than any other woman or man on Earth. And wherever she landed, she was met by enthusiastic crowds and reporters who waited breathlessly for accounts of her and her husband's latest adventures.
I think in many ways Anne Morrow Lindbergh was the first passenger in commercial aviation. Oh, surely there were passengers in planes before that, but she was the first passenger that everyone knew. The way Charles Lindbergh was really the first pilot everybody knew, that everybody felt they owned, that everyone felt connected to, that you could pick up the newspaper and where's Anne Morrow Lindbergh today? And as a result of that, I think Anne Morrow Lindbergh became the symbol of the possibilities of aviation for everyone.
Through her candid descriptions of an average person experiencing the thrill, fear, and even boredom of flight, Lindbergh helped convince Americans that flying was less dangerous than they thought. More and more people began saying to themselves, if Anne Morrow Lindbergh flies, then I want to fly too. With interest in air travel on the rise, small regional airlines gave adventurous passengers a chance to fly on their airmail routes. With few seats available, tickets were extremely hard to come by. The humorist Will Rogers, told there was no more room for passengers on an airmail flight, went to the post office, bought enough stamps, and successfully mailed himself to his destination. There was, however, one man who was quick to recognize the demand. Clement Keyes was an investment banker who had the revolutionary notion that there could be real money in flying people. In 1929, Keyes created Transcontinental Air Transport, TAT, which would one day become TWA. Keyes' unique idea was to offer passengers the first ever coast-to-coast service, traveling on airplanes during the day and trains at night. In a stroke of public relations genius, Keyes hired Charles Lindbergh as an advisor, then named the route the Lindbergh Line. On special occasions, passengers were treated to a flyby from Lucky Lindy himself. But for all the glamour, it was a humble beginning. Whenever there was a problem with a plane, frustrated travelers found themselves back on trains. One passenger, who ended up traveling all the way from New York to Los Angeles by train, begged a conductor, "Will you at least take me to the airport and let me see an airplane?"
Many passengers were shocked to find out that they spent more time on trains than they spent on planes, because the airlines were very reluctant to fly people at night. They flew mail at night, but they were reluctant to actually fly people at night because of the possibility of accidents, which were almost bound to be fatal.
But soon the demand for passenger service would lead to the creation of bigger and safer planes. The most advanced was the Ford Trimotor. Also known as the flying boxcar. Made from corrugated aluminum and fitted with 3 Wright Whirlwind engines, the Trimotor could stay aloft in conditions that would send older planes into a tailspin. Nevertheless, flying in a Trimotor was not for the faint of heart. Pilot Ernest K. Gann was well aware of what his passengers had to endure.
Immediately on boarding, passengers were offered chewing gum, which would allegedly ease the pressure changes on their eardrums during climb and descent. They were also offered cotton, which wise passengers stuffed in their ears, so they'd be able to hear ordinary conversations once they were again on the ground. In the Fords, there were no seat belts. Only hand grips were provided to stabilize passengers. While they bounced around in low-altitude turbulence, the passengers muttered about air pockets. And a high percentage of them became airsick. Summertime flying could become a purgatory. Even with a few windows open, the cabin atmosphere developed a sourness which only time and scrubbing could remove.
Passengers who availed themselves of the lavatory found a surprise waiting for them when they tried to use the toilet.
Once the cover of the toilet was raised, there was revealed a bombardier's direct view of the passing landscape several thousand feet below. And the chill factor instantly discouraged any loitering.
One early passenger declared, "When the day was over, my bones ached, and my whole nervous system was wearied from the noise." But despite the hardships, trimotor flights were regularly filled, for the first time carrying as many as 10 passengers to cities and towns across America. Something remarkable had happened. The age of the daredevil had given way to the age of the passenger. And in the years that lay ahead, one brilliant breakthrough after another would enable more and more people to experience what Anne Morrow Lindbergh called the freedom of a bird. It was a freedom built on the daring of the men and women who first took to the skies.
Since flight is not a natural function of man, since it has been slowly built and not suddenly discovered, it cannot be suspended, as the word freedom is suspended in the mind. It rests firmly supported on a structure of laws, laws to which plane and man alike must conform. Not only must a man know how his plane is made, what it will do, how it must be cared for, but also whether it will go high enough to clear any elevation on the route. He must know how to navigate through a signless sky, what weather conditions he may meet on his way. All this he must know before he can win the freedom of a bird.
The Chasing the Sun adventure continues at PBS Online. Relive the romance of the golden age of flying. Trace the evolution of the world's greatest planes. Learn about the real lives of aviation's pioneers. The interactive journey begins at pbs.org.
Next on Chasing the Sun, Donald Douglas, pioneer plane builder. His DC-1 would have to prove itself on one engine.
She used up 3/4 of the runway before I felt the landing struts lift. Then it happened. Tomlinson of TWA reached out and turned off the right engine. The plane shook and staggered.
Next time on Chasing the Sun.
Chasing the Sun was made possible by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation to enhance public understanding of the role of technology. The foundation also seeks to portray the lives of the men and women engaged in scientific and technological pursuit. The Arthur Vining Davis Foundations, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you. To order a video cassette of this program or the complete 4-part boxed set collection of Chasing the Sun, call 1-800-343-4727 or write to the address on your screen.
This is PBS.